Well, we're on lesson 71, and we're going to be talking about a specific period of time of history. It's called the Middle Time, or the Middle Ages, or medieval times. It was a pretty exciting time when you look back, a time of knights and ladies and castles and kings and tournaments and jousts. But it also was kind of a sad time of crusades, going off to war in crusades, and a time of Black Plague too coming on. So there were a lot of significant things happening during this time. Well, how did the Middle Ages start? How did we get into this time of castles and kings and knights and ladies and all of this? Well, let's go back to what we learned in our last lesson. The year 1066, and we have a king, William the Conqueror. Do you remember William? What battle was this battle? The Battle of Hastings. The English king came down, Harold the Unfortunate, and he collided in the battle with William the Conqueror. So King William comes in. Now, King William is not your normal English king. He comes from Normandy, which is south of England and in northern France. And it's a land that mingled with the French and the English and the Danish and the Scandinavian, but mainly from the north had settled there. And William the Conqueror is known as Norman, but he mainly is from the Scandinavian area. Although William had dreams of being a descendant of King Arthur. And so as he goes into England, he wants to bring back these legends of King Arthur. And he wants to live this life as if he were a King Arthur. Can you imagine that? So what do? First of all, the Norman people, they fled into England, and they start building their own houses, because the English, they mainly built houses maybe out of wood, but they didn't build houses like they did in the north, in Norway and Sweden, Scandinavia. They had houses that were built of earth. They built houses in the earth, and they were domed houses. So now you're going to see the culture kind of changing here. And the styles of the castles. The castles before were not styled in stone. And now we're going to have these beautiful stone castles up here. For in William's time and on, we'll see the magnificence of these castles. The style of their clothing, of course, changed too, to be more Scandinavian than the English way. Their words, the way they spoke. The Old English language had very long words. Well, not so with the Scandinavian words. They were very short, and we'll find out more later about some of the words that were brought in. But the English language started to kind of mingle in with the Scandinavian, the Danish language, and also the French language. They even borrowed words from France. Now the Celtic people, they were moved into Ireland and Wales, and they spoke their own language. So they kind of were isolated. Ireland is another island than England. But here in England, we'll find these ways of the medieval times. Well, let's talk about the way they were and the way William changed them. The first thing is that all these small villages, they had all these little farmers, and they worked together. And they had an area called with common ground, where they put their sheep and their cattle and everything there. And so they all were commonly together, and they got together. And then each village had its own sheriff. And the sheriff would be like the policeman, make sure everything was going okay, or if they're in times of war, he'd go to the king, and then the king would come in, and then all the farmers would gather together and fight the battles. That's the way it usually went. William the Conqueror didn't like that idea. So King William comes in, and he wants to change everything a lot. So he decides that he's the one that's going to own all the land, and then he's going to give out these little parcels, these little fiefs of land to whoever he wants. So he's going to give them out to his knights and his friends and those that he wants to be in charge. And those in charge of these little fiefs would end up calling themselves lords. Kind of a weird thing that they call themselves lords. And under the lords would be the former farmers, the former peasants and everything would all mingle together. In England, they lost their land. And so now they had to work the land for their lord. This was called manorialism. They had to work the land and give their lord profit from whatever he wanted off the land, but then they could live on the land, kind of like they were renting the land. So, and in exchange for power for William, how did this benefit William? Well, his so-called knights would have to come and fight for him when he needed them, whenever he needed them. And they also would give him some, so guess what? The king becomes very wealthy, and the lords, the so-called lords, become extremely wealthy, and the serfs and the peasants stay like serfs and peasants. Manorialism wasn't the best way to live, don't you think? Don't you think they'd want to work for themselves instead of work for someone else all of their life? It's kind of sad. They were kind of not free. And this system would go on to be called feudalism. Feudalism is a military term. Basically, it said these big estates, they started calling these areas which the knight or the lord would be in charge in their so-called little castle there, and all that lived off that they would be called estates. And the serfs living on them, would be protected at certain times. But the feudalism was a military term of protection, where you know that your lord or your knights and the king would have to protect you because you lived there. And then you'd have to pay taxes. Always had to. That's where taxes have always been around, haven't they? And they really thrived during the time of feudalism. Well, the estates. Feudalism, like I said, was a military term, and feudalism meant fiefland. That's where the word came from, fiefland. It meant that land that was given as a gift from the king. So kings and lords and knights living in the castles in these huge houses and having these fiefs. The knights were vassals to the king. That means they were promised to the king, and they'd have these ceremonies that made them knights, that everyone would know that you were a knight, and they would give honor to knights. The fiefs were promised to be passed down to the nobles. The nobles were the lords, to their children. But the oldest son got everything. The second son, third son, they'd have to earn their own fief from the king. So a lot of them their whole idea was that I want to become a knight in shining armor so that I could get some land from the king too. And plus, it was a very honorable thing to do in those times. So the oldest son basically became the lord of the land, and the younger sons went off to war if they needed to go to war and became the knights. The knights earned support from the king by their great acts of courage. The more courageous they were for the king, then the more points they got, or the more honor that they got, and the more land that they got too. The English code. There was an English code they called chivalry. Chivalry was that code that knights would have to go by. And it had a lot of good things. And when you think of chivalry, you think, where did this come from? Did this law come from? Well, in actuality, it came from Christianity. Because a lot of things in there, like not to lie and be honorable and all these things in there, and the way they lived, were a Christian thing to do. They weren't a Viking thing to do. And they weren't an Anglo-Saxon thing to do. They were basically coming from the Bible. So let's talk about this code of chivalry. And so I'm going to go over some things about it here. The Code of Chivalry. Here we go. Here are some of the main codes, or the main ideas in the Code of Chivalry that knights tried to live by. First of all, they were fighting for God and for their country, but they had to follow the church and defend the church with their life. They also had to defend the king. They had to be generous and honest, never to lie, to give honor and to give glory to all, and to the king, of course, and to God, to help the widows and the orphans. And many knights took vows that they would maintain the code. Not all knights followed the code, though, especially when it came to dealing with people with lower classes. But most of all, chivalry had a lot to do about how they would protect their women and how their duty would be to their wife and how they would honor their wife. And no matter how difficult it would be that they would stand and be gentlemen to women. It was kind of a new concept, believe it or not. So, some interesting facts. Before I get into the interesting facts about tournaments and jousts in the Code of Chivalry, let's talk about what it was to become a knight. Okay? Okay, let's talk. So what do you think? Just a minute.